This is Dimitri Lascaris reporting from COP21 in Paris, France. I'm at the site of the conference today at Le Bourget on the outskirts of Paris, and happening behind me is an action that has been organized to demonstrate the commitment of climate activists here to their red lines. Today is officially the last day of the conference, and last night at about 10 o'clock, the conference issued a new draft agreement, a new draft climate accord. And the climate accord represented the draft that came out last night represented a very significant weakening of the terms of the prior draft. Although the purpose of the climate accord in Article 2 now makes reference to the 1.5 degree Celsius limit, it doesn't establish that as the highest limit, or the lowest limit, I should say, for the global temperature increase. What it says rather is that the global temperature increase should be 2 degrees Celsius, well below 2 degrees Celsius, with efforts to be made towards a 1.5 degree Celsius limit. That nevertheless constitutes something of a victory, because there was some concern that the 1.5 degree Celsius limit would not appear anywhere in the agreement, or if it did, it would appear only in the preamble. But it's now still in, and it appears to be final, that it's going to be in Article 2, the operational part of the agreement, which states the purpose of the agreement. More troublingly, however, there is no reference anywhere in the agreement to carbon budgets. There's no reference anywhere in the agreement to fossil fuels or fossil fuel subsidies. The agreement does not require any specific emission reductions by any states, including in particularly developed states who historically have emitted far more on a per capita basis than the developing world. And it doesn't even set a timeline for the complete decarbonization of the global economy. What it says, nor does it set a timeline for the peaking of global emissions of CO2. What it says rather is that CO2 emissions should peak as soon as possible, and that the global economy should be greenhouse gas neutral in the second half of the century, whereas the scientific community is saying quite clearly that the global economy should be completely decarbonized by 2050, so there should be no more CO2 emissions, and CO2 emissions should peak by 2020. It's against this backdrop that 5 world-leading climate scientists convened a press conference this morning here at Le Bourget to discuss the very serious deficiencies in the draft accord. And we're going to hear from 2 of those climate scientists. One of them is Johan Rockstrom from the Stockholm Resilience Center, and he's the chair of the Earth League, which is a grouping of eminent climate scientists from around the world. And he's also a professor of environmental science. That's one of the first members of the 5 scientist panel that we're going to hear from. The second is Kevin Anderson. And Kevin Anderson has been an advisor to the British government on climate change. He is the chair of energy and climate change at the Universities of Manchester and East Anglia. And he has been outspoken in his concern that staying within the 1.5 degree Celsius limit is no longer practically speaking possible, and that we have very little opportunity even to remain within the 2 degrees Celsius limit. So let's hear what these 2 gentlemen had to say at this morning's press conference, which, by the way, was the most heavily attended press conference that I've been at thus far. It was standing room only.
And as the chair of the Earth League, which is a global network of leading Earth system scientists, and a few colleagues on this panel, we put forward the 8 scientific elements of requirement for a successful outcome at COP21. And our assessment is now, in line with what you've heard so far, that we still have the possibility of a transformational change here in Paris, and that the #1 scientific goal is to really limit our warming below the planetary boundary or planetary guardrail of 2 degrees Celsius, and staying as far away as that is possible. And the frustration as scientists at this point is that once you set that global planetary guardrail, everything else must be consistent with that that target? It means decarbonizing the world economy by 2050. It means reaching the 70 to 95% reduction emissions by 2050 as an absolute minimum. And it actually means being careful with statements like greenhouse gas neutrality and rather emphasize decarbonization. Because greenhouse gas neutrality, which is a compromise, opens up for counting in the massive carbon sinks in our biosphere, which today accounts for, as we know, in the order of 55% of the carbon sinks from our burning of fossil fuels. And it opens up for a risky future where you may have carbon storage and capture, which may continue burning fossil fuels, but in fact risking our stability in the future. So even though we are towards a document that will actually transform ourselves in terms of the signals to the investors and business leaders and majors, etc. in the world, there's still some need for this consistency with science. And the Earth League position, therefore, is that we are kind of in a balancing position right now from a scientific perspective. The final comment is just to say that the treaty must set this long-term transition towards a safe future under 2 degrees Celsius, while the pledges should be revised very frequently in order to stay true to the innovation pathways and the disruptive transformations we both are starting to see and need to see in the world. And therefore, from a scientific perspective, there's a lot of support for these revisions to occur biannually or every third year and potentially be an actual action point at the future COP meetings.
I'll start by echoing all of the comments of my colleagues here. But let's remember that the aspiration and the rhetoric in the current text, the text is still open for negotiation, the aspiration and the rhetoric will not deliver reductions in carbon dioxide emissions. It needs to be action. I would say at the moment, I would view the current text as weaker than that came out of Copenhagen. Wow. It is not consistent with science, which the Copenhagen Accord had directly written into it. In addition, the Copenhagen Agreement also included aviation and shipping, two sectors that collectively are combined similar to the emissions from the UK and Germany. These are now exempt from the current text, and they are growing very rapidly indeed. I do not think peaking emissions as soon as possible is scientifically robust, sufficiently robust, and there is no reference to the levels of those peaks. There is no reference to fossil fuels in the document, despite the fact for 1.5 to 2 degrees C, we really need to be keeping around about 90% of all current reserves in the ground. The language of neutrality masks the ruse that we have developed, or the assumptions we have, that we will be able to suck very large quantities of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere in the future, and that means we do not have to have such significant reductions in the near term. That also means without those negative emissions, 1.5 degrees C is not viable. Some people would argue that the current text is described as practical. I've heard that already, that it's a manifesto for green growth, for win-win. But to whom is it practical? It may be practical to those of us here, wealthy high emitters in the Northern Hemisphere. To the poor, climatically vulnerable, non-whites, typically non-whites living in the Southern Hemisphere, the current text is somewhere between dangerous and deadly. There's a slight risk that the document as it is appeasement to our desire to continue to use fossil fuels, to a business as usual model, rather than something that is perhaps more a progressive agenda for humanity.
So after the press conference held this morning by these 5 leading climate scientists from around the world, each of them took questions separately from members of the media, and I and other members of the media had the opportunity to seek from Professor Kevin Anderson an elaboration of his opinion, quite remarkable opinion, that the COP21 Accord, at least the one that's emerging from COP21 at this time, is worse than the infamous Copenhagen Accord. And for those viewers who are from Canada, you may be particularly interested in Professor Anderson's answer to my question in regard to the Trudeau government's commitment to the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit and its simultaneous commitment to the tar sands industry and the expansion of pipeline infrastructure for the tar sands industry. So here's what Professor Anderson had to say after the press conference.
What do we have to do here before 2020 in order to stay below 1.5 degrees in the next few years?
If you think that negative emission technologies will not play out significantly,
then you have to have dramatic reductions in global emissions. And I was trying to point out in there that if you had even just an outside chance of 1.5 degrees C, you would need something like a 7% per annum reduction in global emissions year on year, starting now. And remember that also if you took an equity component into that, then that would be even greater reductions for the wealthier parts of the world, whilst the poorer parts of the world would have to very quickly follow.
So we have to
If you
break.
had to put a percentage chance on actually just limiting to 1.5, as of now, what would you put it at? Is it less than 10?
Yes, less than 10, incredibly slim.
2 degrees.
2 degrees, an outside chance of 2 degrees C. I think that my assessment, and I've been saying that a lot here, and we only now have an outside chance of 2 degrees centigrade. That is viable. We have all the tools and the policy frameworks necessary to do that. We are just choosing not to act in the ways that we need to.
Like the diplomats here don't have the reality of the science involved when they're talking about.
I think they have the reality of the economics, the short-term economics, but less so the reality of the science.
But then the text be improved with what you're saying.
I think the text should have stayed consistent with science. We had the very clear carbon budgets laid out in the IPCC reports. Those budgets should have been, in my view, the premise for the discussions here in Copenhagen, here in Paris rather. Instead, Freudian slip. Instead, what we have are the voluntary pledges from the different nations around the globe that add up to somewhere well above 3 degrees centigrade. Remember, when you see estimates saying that the INDCs add up to 2.7 degrees centigrade, that does already include huge amounts of negative emission technologies. So if you do not think negative emission technologies will work, then the current INDCs are far above 3 degrees C temperature.
What should we do with our coal power plants in the world? There are thousands of them being planned right now.
We should not build any new ones. My view is for the poorer parts of the world, for instance, where the Philippines now are planning to build some new coal-fired power stations, that the West owes reparation to those parts of the world, and that we should pay the difference between the price of the coal-fired power stations and the price of zero carbon power stations. That should be the role of those of us in the wealthy parts of the world who have benefited from using the fossil fuels and, of course, the problem. And it's reparation, not aid.
Could you elaborate on might be worse than the Copenhagen Accord?
Well, just that the Copenhagen Accord is very clear that that we should aim to stay below 2 degrees C, but put action in place to stay below 2 degrees C, consistent with science. And the consistent with science part is very much watered down in the current text. In addition, the Copenhagen Accord did include aviation and shipping. As I say, the emissions from those two sectors are the equivalent of the UK and Germany. They are now removed completely from the text, and these are two sectors that are growing very rapidly indeed. So unless we actually unless we are prepared to seriously consider aviation and shipping, then 2 degrees C is not a viable target. One thing we have to bear in mind that the IPCC report, the carbon budgets that are in there, they all start from 2011. And we are now in the end of 2015, and between 2011 and 2015 we've put out roughly 150 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide. That is about 15% of our likely budget for 2 degrees centigrade. Then once you take other things into account, because I focus on energy, you take other things into account like emissions from the process emissions from cement in particular, that reduces the carbon budget further. And once you take those things into account, the carbon budget that remains for energy is much smaller than the headline budgets you see in the IPCC, and that has has very significant repercussions for the types of policies you would have to put in place for reducing emissions from energy. My focus is on energy.
Sir, the
You said
Canadian
that this
government's,
deal-
if I may, the Canadian government's stated commitment to 1.5 degrees Celsius limit, is that consistent with their commitment to the construction of pipeline infrastructure to deliver tar sands bitumen to market?
I think you know fully well the answer to that question, and it's a two-letter answer, and it begins with N.
Sorry,
Is there any
you answered
nation's
this already.
INDC that is actually committed?
Sorry, you answered this already, but I didn't get on tape. So you said that this draft is worse than the Copenhagen deal. Why?
The current text that we have, two reasons. One, that it is not consistent with science, as the Copenhagen Accord was very clear that we would take action consistent with science. That has been significantly watered down in the current text. And the second, that in the Copenhagen Accord they expressly included aviation and shipping emissions, which are deliberately excluded from this current text.
So what should be done to that it would be better than the Copenhagen?
We need to include aviation and shipping emissions within the text, and actually need to bring about significant reductions in those sectors, and we need to bring science back into the text. I would argue here the text should include carbon budgets in line with the best science that's available, which is at the moment is the IPCC synthesis report.
But the 1.5 degrees Celsius is now in this text. Isn't that a good thing?
It's a good thing politically, and I say this quite carefully now, that I think 1.5 degrees C is appropriate politically, because I hear many voices that you've not heard publicly here, but many people are arguing that, well, we're going to go to 3 or 4 degrees C. So therefore, I think it's really important that poorer communities, or any community, is arguing for 1.5 to counter that other voice that is very important, that is arguing for reaching, well, 2 degrees C is too late, we need to go for 3 or 4. It counters that. If you look at the science and the numbers, my judgment is that 1.5 degrees C is no longer viable. So I think it's an appropriate political goal. I think it's an unachievable scientific goal.
The press conference held by these 5 leading climate scientists concluded several hours ago, and it is now late in the afternoon on Friday, December 11th, officially the last day of COP21. But the public has yet to be told that a final agreement has been struck. No final version of the document has been issued to the public, and many people are concerned that the final product will be even weaker than the one that was so roundly criticized by leading climate scientists this morning. And that's why these people came out here today to establish their red line. For The Real News, this is Dimitri Lascaris reporting from Paris, France, and COP21.